We're going into Chapter 5 today for CCT 250, Footprinting Tools and Techniques. So our learning objective for this chapter is to identify some common information gathering tools and techniques. I've actually thrown in some extra materials from my EC Council materials that I had from when I was getting prepped for my Certified Ethical Hacker. So there's going to be some stuff in here that is in addendum to what we've seen in the text. Our key concepts are going to be information gathering as a whole, specifically some reasons, tools, and techniques for why it's implemented. Footprinting is a data gathering technique, what footprinting is, and how to counter it. We're also going to look at Google hacking or Google dorking, which is a big part of the information grab process for a lot of professionals. So information gathering is where we get information from general resources like an information's website or from Google. It's pretty low impact, but it can provide a lot of useful information. So footprinting covers the first two steps in the process here. Step one and part of step two are passive in nature. They don't require any kind of direct interaction. And that's one of the key characteristics of footprinting, which is we get information indirectly and don't provide advance notice of the attack, or at least potentially. Maybe we can figure out things like the physical and logical dimensions of a network. That's going to be in the latter part of step two, step three kind of area to where we're actually making interactions directly with the network, identifying active computers and devices, finding open ports, active services, access points, figuring out what operating systems we're dealing with, because we can of course target vulnerabilities based on certain operating systems, especially those that are end of life. They don't have a life cycle of support anymore from their manufacturer. We can also look at known vulnerabilities of software that's running. So not only are we dealing with operating systems, but we also have applications that could be potentially open doors for us. So footprinting is really the first step in any information security attack where we get the information about the network. And again, as I said in the previous slide, it can be something that we acquire very passively or something that has a little bit more direct involvement. We want to figure out the security posture. Now, the security posture of a system is kind of difficult to define in simple terms, but the idea is we want to be able to look at how security is interpreted and recognized as a concept in this particular organization. Are they very focused on security? Are they really focused on physical security? Are they focused on logical security? Are employees given awareness training? And what we have to do as attackers is look at what's the weak point. And we transition that to, if we're defenders, and we always have to think on both sides of the fence, right? If we're defenders, where are we most exposed? A phrase you'll hear quite often is attack surface, and this means the areas in which you have an exposed part of your network that can be manipulated in order to possibly carry out an attack. Reduction of the focus area. As an attacker, we don't want to throw everything we have at every aspect of a network because it's going to be a poor waste of our time and it's going to create a high level of visibility. So reduction of the focus area means we're going to say, okay, this is our specific target. This machine has a known vulnerability, or this particular network segment does not have the same rules for their firewall or SIEM or whatever else is going on as other parts of the network. Once we get inside, then we can pivot laterally into a different segment and try and take advantage of that. Identifying vulnerabilities, as I said, there's vulns everywhere. We just have to figure out which one we need. And then possibly drawing a network map. There are people who will do rough diagramming of trying to figure out, okay, this is the hierarchy going from, this vulnerable print server moving all the way up to a router or an IDF or MDF that we can get then to pivot into the rest of the network. Some target information we may want to retrieve would be things that are organizational. This could be employee metrics and details, telephone directories, location, background, what web tech is being employed, things like that. Network information would be domains and subdomains, network blocks, and this means just blocks of IP addresses or registrar addresses that belong to that company. IPs, what they are. Who is information, and we'll talk about who is a little bit later on. DNS, which we already know. And then, of course, we want to be aware of system information, operating system and location of web servers, users and passwords, things that can allow us to gain manipulable access of the system from the net, things that would be considered externally facing in certain cases. Now, I pointed this out earlier, but I did want to reiterate because it's an important concept. Footprinting comes in two primary varieties, passive and active. Passive footprinting has no direct interaction. Active footprinting obviously has direct interaction. It's much more visible, but provides more depth. The quality of information you're able to retrieve is much more robust with active footprinting, obviously. So some things we might do is to examine the company's website, low impact. Identifying key employees. Now this can be difficult. Finding that information out can be very simple, but identifying and verifying that information can be a little bit more involved. So we can see that footprinting passes between the two varieties quite consistently. Open positions and job requests, going on sites like, Glassdoor to figure out, is there a high turnover rate for certain positions, looking on Dice or LinkedIn to try and figure out who's in what position, try and figure out based on, job postings on different websites, those might be indicative of, again, turnover, which means that you could possibly flip an insider, or you could try and plant a mole, you could try and identify when they're likely to create a new user account or have something that's been decommissioned, how long has this person been out of the position, etc. Assess affiliate, parent, or sister companies. This is a very common concept in security, which is exploiting existing trust relationships. If we have a relationship between two companies that have independent structures and they share information, if they have, for example, if they have a vendor relationship or something similar, then it may be easier to try and attack the vendor than it is to attack the primary company and abuse that trust relationship to try and get inside. Again, any way you can get in is a good way. It's just a matter of being able to convert that into something that's usable as a pivot point. Technologies and software that are implemented. Review the network range to determine if the organization is the owner or if they're hosted somewhere else. So in the age of the cloud, is our material hosted locally or is it hosted remotely? Is it a combination of the two? Do we have a public cloud, private cloud, hybrid cloud? Potential for leaked information, message boards, things like that. There's a ton that you can try and traverse. And then once the data has been collected, let's go ahead and review it and see if we can collate information. A lot of times, if we can find the same information from drastically different sources, we can consider its veracity to be slightly higher than something that was just kind of a blurb on social media or whatever else. That's not a guarantee, but that is definitely an indicator that it might be something that needs to be revisited or dug into a little bit more deeply. So the things you might see on the company website would be employee names and email addresses, or just department contacts, branch office locations. There may be a particular branch that may be more vulnerable than others. It may be that they have had a recent turnover and there's no ability to be able to get to this particular branch out in middle of nowhere. They've got a new IT team and they're going through and trying to fix things, but it's kind of chaotic. And then that's where we're able to kind of slip under the radar. You want to try and hide under that cloud of chaos. And then technologies the organization uses. Again, operating systems, applications, what type of hardware they have, what versions they're running. So here is a really handy tool to be able to pull some information about the web page in question. Now, if we look at just the HTML code, we see here in the body, we've got a comment. So whenever you are working with HTML, if you see something with a greater than symbol opening up, or sorry, less than symbol first, and then greater than to close it with an exclamation point, that is an HTML comment. So we can see here, this web page prompts for the password to log on to the database server HAL 9000. So we're seeing some information about the purpose of that particular page, maybe information that should not be public. Because it identifies what server it's trying to connect to and what kind of server it is. Now, this is a very generic one, but I have seen messages where somebody actually has some substantial information in there for debugging purposes, so that they're trying to access it externally, be able to work with it, and it turns out, oh, they're actually leaving themselves exposed in a pretty significant way. And then the second image here is for the Wayback Machine. I believe it's archive.org. If you go there and you type in a URL or specific keywords, you can actually see the history of a particular site. So here you can see what it looks like. Not for all sites, but there are some significant amounts of results rolling all the way back to 1996. So if we go to a website like Jones and Bartlett Learning, jblearning.com, we can see information about that site going back to March 25th of 2004. At the time this grab was done, it was up to September 30th, 2017. I'm sure that would be newer than that today. But we can see these revisions over time. We can see high levels of activity. I've known of people who have used the Wayback Machine to be able to prove that a website changed pricing on something in the middle of a sale and it was not being honored appropriately, things like that. So being able to have this is just an accountability piece for a lot of companies. But because it does not have any filtering and it just archives whatever is being presented, it doesn't necessarily leave out something that's potentially damaging unless that particular organization contacts Wayback and says, hey, I need you to redact something on this particular page or make it inaccessible or things like that. Job postings, we've talked about this. It gives you clues on how infrastructure is organized in a particular organization. So if we have a job posting that says we need advanced knowledge of Windows 8, 10, Server 08, 12, 16, Office 2010, 13, 2016, SQL Server, Information and Internet Services or IIS, and Visual Basic, it's like, oh, well, they need somebody who's able to do admin for their desktops, for their work, their workstations, as well as their servers. And then, of course, they use Microsoft Office, which is pretty industry standard. But then we've also got, they have a SQL server. Ooh, SQL injection's a big target. Visual Basic, probably for some front end interfaces, as well as maybe a little bit of back end integration. And then we have relevant knowledge and experience, Cisco PIX, Checkpoint Firewall. That's okay. So there's some filtering going on with network traffic. VMware, SAP, and other data gathering systems, Active Directory, Semantic Security Suite. So in this way, I would be able to look at this and say, okay, Active Directory in Windows, that's probably the primary authentication method that they're using. So if you can, manipulate the AD, especially if they go all the way back to Server 2008, obviously here we are sitting in 2022, 14 years later, the life cycle for that has obviously lapsed. So we can be aware that if that is present on the system, there's probably an entry point we could take advantage of. So it's important to understand this is just a snippet of a larger job posting, and it gives you some insight. It's not necessarily true that the information here is going to give you all the information that you need to launch an attack, but it could allow you to fine-tune an attack looking for the vulnerabilities that I mentioned previously. Configuration issues, product-specific defects. So there's lots of things that we could potentially target. Financial information. If you watch the movie V for Vendetta, one of my favorite lines, which I cannot remember was taken from the comic or not, but one of the police officers who's investigating the incident that created V says the only accurate records are tax records. And that's often true. Being able to look back at financials and see how something progressed is going to be a critical aspect of being able to determine whether or not a particular record is accurate. So if we look at the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, their database is called Electronic Data Gathering, Analysis, and Retrieval, or EDGAR. We have the financial analysis site Hoover's. We have Dun & Bradstreet, Yahoo Finance, Bloomberg, Google Money. There's a number of different ones there. Obviously, the federal level stuff is going to be a little bit more robust and extensive, but it's always good to get a second opinion. Here we can see a screen grab from EDGAR for Cisco systems. So we can see a number of different filings. We can see their former names if necessary based on older filings. We can see transactions that are being transmitted, things like that. So if we look through the EDGAR database, we can see registration statements. periodic reports, quarterly and yearly reports, which are 10Qs and 10Ks. They give you names, addresses, financial data, acquired or divested industries that are considered to be consolidated into the parent company or set up separated from it. The names of principals. Now, not principal like in school, but like principal members of the business operation. So that would be the president, members of the board, technical officers in certain cases if they're dealing with specific aspects of being able to file for, subdivisions or C corping or things like that. Google hacking, excuse me. This is a methodology that we use in order to locate information using the Google search engine. So the Google search engine has these built-in components that you can use to streamline your search, but it can also be used to find vulnerabilities in a site. So you can also do this through Google competitors Yahoo and Bing. It's not quite as robustly explored in my experience. Most people tend to go through ExploitDB or GHDB to be able to pull off these dorks. Now, a Google dork is a specific type of query that's used to extract info like error messages or login pages or websites. So I'll show you a couple of examples here. If we look at the bottom of the right-hand graphic, on November 19th, 2021, there was a dork that was found, forward in title @Vise-next generation. So if we look at that, we see @Vise, which is a brand name, obviously. This is because whenever you use a web-based login portal, you will often run into situations where there is a title bar on the browser or something else that tells you what machine you're accessing. Now, if that is visible externally, then that means that you can potentially take care of an exploit that would be applied to that particular piece of hardware or software. So again, it's just another form of banner grabbing, but it can be done through Google. And again, there's tons of ways to anonymize your traffic so that it's harder to tell with the millions and millions and millions of queries that Google gets, which one is the malicious one, how do we track down where it came from, blah, blah, blah. So here are some of the advanced search operators that we see in Google Dorking that gives us the ability to find some extra information. Cache, like Google has stuff that's cached to be able to deliver a certain page faster. Google does indexing. A lot of people get confused about what a search engine actually does. It uses what are called robots or web spiders to crawl the web and to find information on different pages. So if you have one page that has a set of links, those links go to another page, those links go to another page. So you have this recursive process of going outward and outward and outward and identifying all of this information. And then we reinforce and update the links as needed. And based on the level of traffic that Google receives, the results get better and better. So it's a self-enhancing algorithm. But that means that a cached page, something that was a holdover copy, kind of like what they do for the Wayback Machine, means that you could be able to retrieve information that's potentially sensitive or out of date, being able to spoof in certain ways. Link, if we find a page that has a link to a specified page, we can try and find affiliations. Related, info, site. Site's really handy because it allows you to restrict them to a given domain. So if you know the domains and subdomains of a company, you can try and restrict searches within that particular arena. All in title, all in URL, and URL and location. All of these allow us to specify very specific parameters to try and lock down what we're looking for within that window. And we're letting the Google search engine hardware, what they're doing on their servers, wherever they happen to have their data center located, do the work for us for that indexing. So very smart usage of resources. And then we have things like different types of vulnerabilities that we could discover through the Google hacking database, like footholds, error messages, things like that. Error messages are a common target that I use whenever I run a pen test, simply because there's a lot of things that are out there that people don't think about. If they have error messages turned on and they're working as an administrator, they're like, I want it to be verbose. I want it to have as much descriptive information as possible so I can fix this. And if you're working remote, which in the age of COVID is a big thing, those error messages aren't encrypted, or the key exchange to start them out is not. So there are lots of things that could leave you into potentially vulnerable avenues, just as an example. Here we have some examples of using in title to be able to find a particular phrase, index of, either with or without a period, within certain types of things. So if we're looking in etc/shadow, shadow of course is a directory that we have in Linux to, machines. HT password, finances.xls. Finances.xls, of course, we know that that's a spreadsheet. So there's a couple of different items to try and find this index document within these particular containers. Here we have file type BAK. So if we go to HT access password shadow HT users, it's looking for a backup file. A backup file may actually contain a password digest. Configure slapd.conf, MDB URL for administrators, and you can see that they're using the OR pipes. So if you hold shift and you hit the backslash above the enter key, that is a pipe. A pipe is indicative of the operator OR. So if you use the ampersand, which is shift 7, that is a conjoining item. If you haven't looked over logical primers, that is something that you definitely want to take a look at. Logical operators to where you're using and, or, XOR, NAND, NOR, things like that. There's a lot of variations that you can use to construct these queries and test them out. Here we can see in title, index.of, Microsoft-IIS/6.0 server. So we can look for, in the first entry, index of netBSD, we know that this is running Microsoft IIS server version 6 at ftp.twern.net. So it's handy to be able to say, oh, I've got a target that is running a known version of this server on this port at this address. That is absolute gold for an intruder. Here we can see in URL, instead of doing, in title or things like that, we can see within the uniform resource locator URL what content is presented. This is useful if we know how strings are produced, like how does a string read a space in a document? Well, it's usually going to be %20, right? So if we can write that in as part of a string and be able to find those spaces, we may be able to actually read those as, instead of Unicode, read them as ASCII or other manipulables to try and force transitions into a different area of an FTP directory or similar. And then if we have different types of applications that may use a specific format for a particular string, things like that. I'm not going to read through all of this, but this is a really good example of some different dorks that you might look at in order to be able to gain access to a particular aspect of some organization. Just for example, you've got some login portals, some configuration manuals, things like that. So if you want to pause here and take a look at some of these descriptions, these are just some examples of things that you might see. And one of the ones that I noticed that's fairly interesting is the use of quotes. And this is something that a lot of people slip on because it is an item we don't think about. We usually just type in what we look for into Google and it hands us back what we want. But if we have specific terms that we need to return as part of our results, we have to put them in quotes. So if you look in the bottom left, in title, sapura.spa.configuration in quotes. And we also see that they have a minus sign. So this means it is going to exclude things that have the .pdf extension included. So, being able to include, exclude, conjoin, things like that, being able to deal with those logical operators, definitely going to help you with Google hacking. Domain information leakage. So this would be things like manual queries to a registrar, automatic queries to a registrar, whois lookups, NS lookup, which is a utility you have on your machine right now. Knowing how to go through indexes for IANA, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. They're responsible for signing blocks of access numbers or IPs to different organizations. And then being able to determine a network range for a business. The root zone database can be used to determine a network range manually. So if you go to iana.org/domains/root/db, you can actually take a look at that. So here we see just an example of a manual registrar query. We are basically getting some documentation about smu.edu, Southern Methodist University. We can see that their registrant information is in Dallas, Texas. We can see that their administrative contact is David Wynn. We can see that their address is the same as the registrant office. We can see David Wynn's email. We can see their point of technical contact for their network operations center. And what they've done here is smart. It is a generic email as opposed to being an individual, so that way they can't try and target that individual, which means that that email is probably monitored by several different people. And then having multiple checks and balances is usually a positive. We can also see, as we look further down the listing, some name servers that are related to SMU. So we have ePony, XPony, standardpony.cis, and then we have C's. So these are probably some different subcategories for different aspects of that university. Maybe their, computer information systems or CIS department has its own name server for certain access points. When was the domain record activated? When was it updated? When does it expire? There was a guy a couple of years ago who, took advantage of the fact that Google did not have their registration renewal automatically set up, and they were able to jump in and grab it before Google could. And obviously, he used it to, make some money for charity. But it was interesting to see that they were, one of the hugest companies in information technology is just slipping. Then we look over on the right, and we can see here that we've got some information about point of contact for a particular IP address. And then the bottom right, definitely one you want to be aware of is the regional internet registries. There's only 5, so it's pretty easy to remember. ARIN is the North America and South America entries. APNIC is Asia Pacific. RIPE is the Europe, Middle East, and parts of Africa, Northern Africa specifically. LACNIC is Latin America and the Caribbean. And then we have AFRINIC, which does most of Africa, the lower 2/3 or so, as I recall. So these are examples of regional internet registries that are responsible for management, distribution, and registration of public IPs within their assigned regions. Here we can see a grab of ARIN's site up here, the American Registry for Internet Numbers. Remember, again, that's North and South America. You can see the whois information. You can see your publicly identified IPv6 address. You can go ahead and log in and create an account to be able to access different requests and set up billing info for your particular site, being able to go through them directly for invoicing. And here we can actually identify, based on 129.119.64.10, who they are, and get the range of IP addresses that are assigned to them, so that maybe there's an IP in that block that's not being used. So it's something that is assigned to them, it's viable, but we can find a way to try and spoof it. So here we can see a little bit more about the ARIN search results. See their name, see their parent organization. We can see, again, confirmation of some of the info that we had there, like when the registration was first done, related organizations. We can see a RESTful link to be able to access that particular information via an API for scraping purposes. Here we can see some different contact information. We've got technical information, administrator, an abuse entry. Here we've got some other information about, the network office connection, the physical address. All this stuff is reinforcing what we've already seen, and we're just using that for verification and validation of the data we've already pulled. Another piece would be to do some of this stuff automatically, and a lot of these are built on the kind of RESTful API stuff that we showed already that you could scrape. So betterwhois.com, Geek Tools, AllNet Tools, Smart Whois, DNS stuff, and whois.domaintools.com. So here we can see the result given from an automatic pull. This is from whois.domaintools.com. This is the one that I use most often. We can see some quick contact information. We can see its IP location, its register location, how many archive records have been set up on Whois for it. You can see what the website title is, what its current server type is. It's running IIS 7.5. Search engine optimization score. You can actually see some accommodation stuff. You can see here that it's got 1,069 unique terms present. You've got 17 images with 3 of them missing alt tags. So again, those are American Disability Act accommodations. And then you've got some links that feed inbound and outbound. So we can identify some different pathways to be able to go into or out of that particular domain. Whois deals with a database maintained by the RURs and contains personal information of a domain owner. So it could be domain name details, net range, when it was created. So we see some of that already. It's going to be designed to interrogate internet DNS and give us some ownership, addresses, locations, etc. The availability of the tool depends on your operating system, but if you have Windows, you should be able to work with Whois through your net browser and be able to verify some of that stuff with NSLookup and things like that very easily. NSLookup specifically is able to find different types of records. So if we do set type, this is where we're doing an interactive mode. We're setting the type to MX or mail exchange. Mail exchange is just mail servers. So if we go to cisco.com, it's going to go ahead and spit back, whatever server and address it's got. And then it's going to say, okay, we've got a non-authoritative answer. Mail server is SMTP 1, 2, and 3, and 4. So that gives you an idea of some of the mail servers you might be able to go after. Authoritative answers can be found from these specific name servers that are assigned to that company, and then we can see the addresses for each one. So again, we're just kind of unrolling some of this information. A lot of people don't think about this, but a lot of this information is automatically being processed by your internet browser or what have you. But the obfuscation, how much of it is abstracted that you don't see, is pretty impressive. Here we have a site scan for Villanova through EduCause. It's just an example of a record that you might pull from a site like IANA. IANA is responsible for coordination of the DNS root. DNS root is the primary servers that are used to hold DNS accountable throughout the entire globe. So a lot of people say, nobody owns the net, nobody can control the net, and that's not absolutely true. It's largely true, but there are issues that you can run into with being able to coordinate transitions of information from an IP address to a known FQDN, fully qualified domain name through DNS. If we're trying to determine a network range for a particular block, again, you're just going to want to go to that RUR. So again, I'm just going to give you the rundown of the 5 primaries here for North and South America. We've got between Aaron and Lacnic. You've got Réseau IP Europeans Network Coordination Center, or RIPE NCC. Asia Pacific, and then you've got the African Network Information Center, AFRINIC. Now, this is a very useful tool built into pretty much every operating system I've ever used, Traceroute. Traceroute uses the time to live function of a standard ICMP transmission message, usually like a ping request or an echo request, to judge where something is on a particular network. So to identify the path to a site, what routers are we going through, what servers are we going through, we go ahead and type in the IP address, and it bounces one packet to the first stop, one packet to the second stop, one packet to the third stop, again and again and again. How does it know first and second and third? Well, as the route is constructed, it sends a packet with a TTL of 1. So that means it reaches the first device, it dies, and it sends back an error message. The second one has a TTL of 2, so it reaches the second one, dies, and sends back an error message. So let's visualize that. Here we can see the echo request and error message popping back. And as we go from device to device, we can see basically just some latency information. We can possibly grab some information about that local IP, what it is, what subdomain it might be a part of, etc. So there's a lot of fleshing out that we can do to figure out what the pathway looks like getting to a particular device. Why is this important? Well, if we know the route that information has to take to go from where we are to get to a particular host, and we do that from multiple places, usually through proxies, we can try and triangulate the best route within a certain point to be able to gain access directly to that server. So if we can say, okay, I've gone ahead and I've targeted this site from North Carolina, from California, from Minnesota, and from, let's say, Honduras. Let's pick somewhere outside the US. If I can say that the last 4 steps are almost always the same in terms of the ranges and things like that, that may be something to target that might be either close to or just outside of the control of the organization that is providing that particular access. Tracking an organization's employees. I don't mean to say this in a mean way, but there's no real other way to say it. People are stupid. Now, a person can be smart. A person obviously can make great decisions. But people, when they get into groups, tend to start losing a certain aspect of critical thinking. It takes a lot more volition to make firm and good choices when you're in a group situation. Groupthink is real, team think is real. And while I believe that collaboration and cooperation is absolutely critical, it can be um, a bit of an impediment. When we get online and people post these quizzes, and it's just like, you know, your, Space Ranger name is your model of your first car, plus the street you lived on, plus your dog's name, things like that. What that's actually doing is performing social engineering to get information that would normally be used for password recovery. So a lot of people don't think about that, but that stuff is really, really passive. And if you're interested in being part of the crowd or in participating in something, sometimes that critical thinking disengages. So things that we could get about employees or about the organization, what's posted online in terms of photos? Do they have social events that they try and promote in order to get people to come and work for them? It's like, oh, it's fun to come and work for us. We have a great time. We go down to the river and we have a barbecue. Everybody has a couple of beers, and then we put the CEO in the dunk tank and things like that. So information like that can be publicly posted, or it can be gathered through very little extra research. Content about personal activities. If you have if you're a practicing Taekwondo martial artist, that may be something that they can use to try and get in behind the way. They might be like, oh, well, passwords might be more likely to be in Korean because they have these different terminologies they use in Taekwondo. Political or activist affiliations. If you are somebody who is, in belief of, goodness, there's so many different organizations. Let's just say one of the more common ones these days would be Black Lives Matter, of course. Um, that could indicate certain interpersonal relations or the possibility that you would be part of certain groups, things that could be leveraged against you possibly. If we go back to the McCarthyism of the 50s, the internet didn't exist at that point, but I'm fairly certain that there would have been some serious scrutiny over certain people's quote unquote pages had it done so. Derogatory information about previous employers, discriminatory comments, fabricated qualifications, um, all of this can be used for possible extortion, things like that. Sites can also be examined for names, email addresses, phone numbers through things like blogs. If you have somebody like with Microsoft, there's a guy named Larry Herb who is Major Nelson, and he is kind of the face of the online Xbox community. It has been for a long time, and his presence, I'm sure is very carefully curated by Microsoft because there's a lot of information he probably has access to that could be either misconstrued or abused. Going through Facebook or Twitter or YouTube or LinkedIn, all of these different domains can have personal pages for an individual that can be used to put things together. There is a tool in Python called the Harvester that can be used for LinkedIn, being able to harvest information about a company based on that. Or you can use, there's another tool, I can't remember the name of it right now, but you can put in a person's name and it will try and find all instances based on common permutations of that name on various sites like Flickr, for photo hosting, or maybe a Google Sites page or things like that. So here we have an information site called Zaba Search. There's also, Intellius and Spokio. These are sites that are able to aggregate openly available information just by connecting to these registries. But in order to pull it, you usually have to pay them a fee in order to kind of aggregate that info. So the information is available. It's just they have to be able to be the ones to run it for you to aggregate it into a nice clean report. Some people are like, well, to heck with that. I'll go ahead and do it myself and, go down to the records office and look stuff up manually, which is absolutely a thing you can do. Insecure applications, we already know, things like Telnet, file transport protocol, the R commands, post office protocol, hypertext transfer, website protocol. That's fairly common for exploitation. And then SNMP, that one gets used a lot. Here we can see, remote desktop web connection through Windows. We have all kinds of different things that can be run through that. It's great when it's run well, but if the security is not configured correctly, or if you give access like this to someone who you do not know, online tech support or things like that, it can get a little bit messy. So we always want to make sure that we know who we're doing business with. Social networks have a lot to recommend them, but they also have a lot of pitfalls, and people don't necessarily want to take advantage um, of the available information to protect themselves. Potentially malicious URLs, things that are embedded, things that are made available by adding someone as a friend or whatever else. If you click on things like a game that does trivia or fantasy sports, that information that you have available on your page for applications, you could inadvertently give it permissions to be able to extract all kinds of stuff that you would probably want to keep private. So this is valuable to both ethical and non-ethical hackers. So some other things that we can see, not necessarily from social media, but from social engineering, is being able to exploit human behavior to extract confidential information. That's what social engineering is. So what we're trying to do is trying to get people to lower their guard about information they would normally want to keep safe. So credit card details, of course, big target, social security number, usernames, passwords, operating systems, IP addresses, and it can take several forms. Eavesdropping, literally just kind of listening around the corner, shoulder surfing, hanging out over somebody's shoulder, they're sitting, you're standing, you can kind of peer over at what they're doing and be able to figure out what their password is or a particular site that they're using for a certain resource. Dumpster diving, literally going and digging in the trash to find information about stuff, old printouts, old flash drives. And then we can use that to build a profile and perform straight up impersonation. Some other techniques to be aware of is, advanced image search, with Google, reverse image search. There are specific video search engines. You can use tools like YT Data Viewer or EasyGIF and be able to extract information out of that, like EXIF information about the camera that was used to record the video or when it was uploaded, where it was uploaded from, thumbnails that were generated. Meta search engines, things like Metager or StartPage, these can pull information about a target from a number of different search engines and be able to aggregate them. So Meta in this case just basically means a search engine of search engines. There are FTP specific search engines like Napalm. These will look for critical files about a business. IoT search engines or any kind of device search engines would be things like Thingful, Census, or Shodan. Shodan is probably the one that I use most often, and it can help you to find accessible devices, not just IoT, but any kind of network device, to figure out its physical location, its IP, any ports that might be running, manufacturer. In certain cases, you can figure out what version it's running. It's really, really terrifying because a lot of people in the current market are like, hey, I love IoT devices. I love automating things to where I can control stuff with my phone. But if they don't think about the security that's needed to be able to make that work in a meaningful and secure way, they're leaving themselves open quite significantly. Of course, there's a ton of different countermeasures. I wanted to be able to give you some loose categories here, and then of course on the next slide we'll go into some specifics. A lot of times it just comes down to controlling what information about your organization or you as an individual produce that becomes available online. So if you have internal network information that you would prefer to keep quiet, and who doesn't, you can restrict that access directly on your local network by means of your firewall or any other number of different restrictions that can be put in place. Configure your web servers to avoid leakage. You want to make sure that you go through a security assessment or other evaluation to make sure what is visible from outside. Encourage employee pseudonyms. It's like, hey, if you're going to write about the company, let's go ahead and have an approved pseudonym that you're going to use to be able to give that information. I brought him up earlier. Larry Herb is Major Nelson, and most people just refer to him as Major Nelson by his internet handle, even though his actual first name is involved. And a lot of people have that happen. The guy who created Minecraft, most people don't know Marcus Persson, but they know Notch. They're familiar with these people as part of their actual persona rather than their true identity. Critical information should be protected in press releases, annual reports, catalogs. You should have individuals who go over this information to make sure, hey, this looks like it might be kind of touchy in terms of being able to provide information that could be manipulable. So let's go ahead and edit that or put it in some kind of couch term. Anonymous registrars for being able to decentralize the WHOIS information. We're registered through this particular registry, and then they have their public information out as opposed to us. Split DNS to be able to have a difference between internal and external DNS, so that way we have that extra layer of filtering. Restrict zone transfer so that people can't zone walk. Disable directory listings in web servers so that way somebody can't go to the standard Apache directory to be able to traverse all the content of your server. Avoid domain level crosslinks for critical assets. Encrypt and password sensitive information. Keep critical documents offline. Training employees. This is really, really critical. People often can't defend against things that they're unaware of. There are certain things that seem really egregious. They're very, very obvious. Other things are a little bit more subtle, so you have to be careful. You can't treat every employee like they're a software engineer or like they're a security specialist or that they're a hacker, which a lot of us tend to wear multiple hats, but a lot of employees that we're trying to help and protect don't necessarily have that happen. Geolocation, and geotagging. This is where a device can actually use cellular triangulation to say, this is where I was when this happened. Give you a little story. So for those of you who don't know, McAfee antivirus was started by a guy named John McAfee, and he's a little bit of a loon. Now, I mean to speak ill of the dead. He has died, but he was in trouble in South America, and the authorities were looking for him, and he was hiding out, and he hid out pretty well. He eventually did an interview with the press, and they had photos, and the guys sat down and had drinks and were talking and whatever else, and everything was cool. And then they published the photos and everything else, but they did not scrub the EXIF data. So the EXIF data had the geotag of where they were when they took those images, and that's how they caught him. They trumped in and be able to extract him from that location. So that's the thing, is that a lot of people don't think about all the various items that could be problematic as you're going through, publishing information about a particular organization that you're affiliated with or one that you are able to manage yourself. And there's a lot of different accessibility for this, but it all starts with awareness. Let's do a quick recap of what we talked about today. Information gathering, we got our reasons, tools, techniques, and I know some of them seem like I belabored it a little bit of extra repetition, but that's because it is absolutely critical to understand what information gathering is. There's competitive intelligence, there's footprinting, all these different things, and how they help us in our job in being able to defend against attacks by helping us to see what an attacker would see. Footprinting is a data gathering technique, countermeasures, Google hacking, a lot of good information today. So I thank you guys for your time and attention as per usual. If you have any questions or concerns, you can always reach me via email, through leaving comments here in the channel. You can go ahead and contact me via Microsoft Teams through our Wake Tech site. And if there's anything I can do for you in terms of clarifying this information, or if you'd like a little bit more elaboration, I'm glad to do that. So have a wonderful day, and I will see you next class.